Hello, my name is Dawn Nakagawa, and you're listening to the Ideas Matter podcast by the Berggruen Institute. Arati Prabhakar has had an incredible career. She's an engineer, venture capitalist, and former head of Darpa. Most importantly, we're proud to count her among our Berggruen Institute Alumni Fellows. Today, she's the CEO and founder of an organization called Actuate. Its mission is to apply the Darpa principles of innovation to some of the biggest social challenges of our time, using big data and social science. The ambitions of her project and her embrace of the need for radical new approaches are well aligned with the spirit of our work at the Berggruen Institute. We are delighted to have her on the podcast today. Welcome, Arati.
So I just wanted to start, for everybody's benefit, give us a sense of what Actuate is, what its mission is, and I guess how it's different from other things that are out there trying to solve social problems.
Absolutely. Actuate is the result of a journey that started when I left Darpa. I was director there until January of 2017. And it's a journey that led me through CASBAS, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, where I was the Berggruen Fellow. So it's actually terrific to get to come tell you what came out of that process. And the journey for me began as I was leaving Darpa, and I reflected on how fortunate I was that I had gotten to participate in research and development and technology and innovation in the US from a whole bunch of different perspectives, from leading Darpa, previously leading NIST, had very different public organization, and then in between spending 15 years in Silicon Valley, including early stage venture for most of that. And my view at that point was that we are phenomenally good. We have a tremendous engine, a tremendous capacity for innovation for the problems that we identified in the last century. We are phenomenal at national security, at information technology, we set out to be great at health. We ended up being good at biomedicine, so that's good, although incomplete. And we're very good at funding basic research in universities. And none of those challenges have gone away, but my concern, my growing concern, and the thing that wouldn't leave me alone was this view that we have major challenges that how we navigate them in the next few decades will determine whether we succeed or fail as a society. And yet these are not areas for which we have vigorous, robust, energetic R&D and innovation and experimentation. And at the same time, I think there are some new changes, new opportunities that are emerging from research and new approaches, new methodologies that actually could be brought to bear on some of these very, very hard challenges. That's what I was wrestling with during my year at CASBAS. I ended up focusing on 4 major challenges that I mean, these are not undiscovered problems, but these are 4 examples, I think, of critical challenges where we have significant gaps in innovation and experimentation, and where there are things we could do about them. These are access to opportunity for every person in our country. It's access to better health outcomes at a much lower cost than our current healthcare system. It's being able to trust data and information in this information age that we're living in. And finally, and obviously, it's dealing with the massive challenges of climate change. And that was the beginning of Actuate, was a recognition that it's time for new forms of innovation and experimentation in these areas. And you know, it's easy to observe these problems. I spent a lot of time saying, well, what am I going to do about that? And what I really want with my co-founder, who I met at Darpa, what we really want to do is bring what we know about powerful models for solutions R&D and start building that capacity for these kinds of societal challenges.
So small stuff, yeah, not ambitious goals at all. Well, I'm really grateful to hear that so much of the thinking that was done during our fellowship. So we will make sure to take all the credit for all your success. That's wonderful. That's really fantastic to hear. I'm really glad when you run a fellowship, you don't always have the luxury of hearing sort of what comes out of it. And sometimes it comes back to you, sometimes it doesn't. But this is a fantastic outcome. So I'm really grateful that that's developed that way. So going back to, you know, we have this institutional infrastructure for R&D right now that's really good at solving 20th century problems. It kind of begs the question, why have we not either turned those institutions towards these issues Or if they're not the right institutions to do that, why haven't we invented or innovated in this space? I guess it seems like there's this very storied past about government, investing in R&D and developing amazing technologies, usually applied for maybe military or space exploration or whatever, that end up making it into the marketplace and changing our lives in really in great ways. And there's lots of those stories. It feels like not only has that kind of slowed down, and it doesn't feel like it's as robust. Maybe it is, and that's just my perception. But it also feels like, as you say, it's not addressing the right things, right? And so the kinds of changes it's making in our lives are not the kind of changes we really need our resources to be trained on in that way. So what is it? Is it a gap in? Is it just sort of institutional legacy that we're not looking at the right things and we need new institutions, or is there something else that's changed in that supply chain of R&D to market or commercialization that has made that a less robust system?
The systems that we have are the result of the world that we live in and the choices that we make. And at the end of the Second War, the United States made some very deliberate choices about what R&D could look like in this country. They were very informed by coming out of the Second War and seeing what R&D could contribute to that horrible period of time, but also a recognition that with the rest of the world picking up pieces, we had to surge ahead and provide a foundation of research that for the whole world, not just for us. So those were terrific priorities. And at that moment in time in 1945, if you looked around and you said, what are our hardest problems and where can we couple those with real opportunities? Because, problems always exist. Not always do you have solutions that you can do something about to solve those problems. So when, in 1945, if you looked at problems and opportunities, what you saw was the barest beginnings of information technology. You knew that the physical sciences and engineering were going to make huge contributions. You could begin to see computer science if you were pretty creative. You knew that we needed fundamental research, basic research in our university-based, something that was not very vigorous or robust in the US beforehand. You knew we cared about health, and biology was starting to unearth these amazing marvels. So it makes total sense to me that we got very, very good with concerted effort based on that set of problems and opportunities. So now let's fast forward to 2020. I mentioned 4 major problems that I think face our society. Some of them, like access to opportunity, are always problems. This is what humanity has been wrestling with since the beginning of time. Some of them are problems that we didn't even know were going to be problems in 1945. For example, climate. For example, trusting data and information. If you're not in the information age, you don't know how important that's going to be. So, but this is where we are, those kinds of very hard challenges. And now the next step is then you have to say, well, what's different in terms of what we could do about these challenges? And, the reason I went to CASPAS for a year was coming out of DARPA. We had just started to do some very early work on thinking about social science and the role that it was, how it's changing, how it could become a more powerful tool, and in particular what it meant for national security in that context. By the way, if you don't understand humans and human behavior and human interactions and how societies deal with hard problems, you can't even begin to think about national security. So it seemed to us that it was core, and we saw these new opportunities. So that was my mindset. But I, having been trained as an electrical engineer and applied physicist, I didn't know very much about social science or social scientists, and I had this tremendous opportunity to go to CASPAS. Margaret Levy said, why don't you come hang out with 36 social scientists for a year and get a sense of what's really happening and how this community thinks and operates. And that actually, I emerged with a much stronger conviction than ever that as an example of what's possible in 2020 that was not available to us in 1945 is what's happening in the social sciences, not just these research fields, not only their ability to understand what's happening in these very complex human systems, but beyond knowing and understanding, which is the language of science, we can now start thinking about in the language of solutions, which is about solving problems and creating new opportunities. And I think that social science to me is at a very interesting inflection point. It's barely visible, but I think the potential is huge. And that's, to me, a very strong example of why now can we tackle these problems in our society. And then, Dawn, to your point about institutions, institutions are a set of incentives and funding and people that build around these strategic choices that are made. We haven't yet really made a strategic choice to innovate and experiment using these new tools for these kinds of societal problems. And I think that's the big opportunity, to start this huge shift, a generational advance that can happen in innovation now.
I think that's really inspirational, because it comes, the way you're talking about it, it really comes from a place of how the opportunity landscape has changed. It's not so much, there are new problems for sure, but there are also new ways of solving those problems, because we have this massive amount of data at our disposal, and we can actually start to mine it in new ways that was never available to us before, to really understand the complexities of human systems. I think it's probably the most fascinating horizon of research available to us. I think it's amazing. So that's great. Going back to the four areas that you talked about in the paper about Actuate that I was reading, it talks about the data and information trust. And it seems to me, and maybe I've got this wrong, but I'd like to understand it better. In a way, that's the foundation of all the other areas as well, right? And in order to do the research that we need to do, we do need to solve the problem of information, well, misinformation, I guess, but also protecting data privacy at the same time as making all that data available so this research can be done. So can you talk a little bit, I guess, about that area? Is that where you're starting your work?
That is exactly one of our first programs. I should back up and say that we just formed the organization last summer. We're at a seed stage, and what we're doing at this stage is defining our first few programs. And precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, one of our first programs is about data and privacy. And here the challenge is to take, I think everyone is starting to get very excited about the kind of understanding that we can get by looking at this vast amount of data. It's happening in the commercial sector at a phenomenal rate, and there we are concerned about privacy exposure and whether our privacy is being well treated or not. There's a whole different class of data, administrative data, tax records, census records, healthcare data, educational data, that actually has deeply private information, but the privacy is very well protected. That's the good news. The bad news is it's almost wholly inaccessible. Very few people get their hands on it because of the privacy protections. And in particular, a lot of the most interesting insights, of course, come if you can combine private data and all of these kinds of often government-held administrative data. That's the dream. It's barely happening, and when it happens, it's this long, slow, arduous process. One of the opportunities that we've identified is to harvest a whole host of new technologies that secure computation, differential privacy. These are being used in one-off with a lot of hard labor in one data problem after another. We think it's going to be possible to build an end-to-end open source architecture that allows for vast stores of data to be provided, encrypted, protected, so that privacy is preserved, but available with rigorous privacy protection for both social science researchers to start looking at these hard problems, but also policymakers who can start implementing the results of the insights that can come from that data.
That sounds like a dream come true. So my background was at McKinsey & Company, and the one thing we always struggled with is we'd go into companies, they did not have data, right? This was in the days before data was even collected, and we'd have to go out and do the primary research to gather it. And so when I hear vast amounts of data available, it sounds so super exciting. And I do believe that the insights that can be derived by the people asking the right questions and training AI and computational systems on that data could be just incredible things that we can't even imagine. So that's super exciting. That's wonderful. I'm wondering though, because as I read through what you were saying, there were two things actually that came out. Our R&D system, as I described before, this storied process of things becoming commercialized, ideas becoming commercialized and changing our lives, has been obviously a boon, particularly for the 21st century. We have the 21st century we have now because of those processes and that supply chain. But you talked in your lecture, the Carey lecture last year, about the things that are left on the shelf. This process of commercialization, which is what we have at our disposal, leaves something to be desired, right? It does leave some really good ideas, particularly in some, primary natural sciences, great insights. It leaves them on the shelf because they don't have necessarily any obvious application or commercialization. It seems like in our capitalist society, it's really the only way we bring great insights to bear in the marketplace and in real life, have an impact. Is there an alternative to that? I mean, is there some other way we can take insights and have them impact real life without it being a commercial process?
There are four or five really interesting questions wrapped up in that. So let me pull one of the threads. First of all, where we aim to live in Actuate is exactly this place that you're talking about. It's downstream from the kind of basic research that leads to new insights that ends with publishing a paper. But it's upstream of the implementation of new ideas at a scale that reaches everybody and actually has impact. We want to be in this pivot place in the middle, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, is that anyone who's lived in the reality of trying to get from a research insight to actually changing the world realizes that a few other things have to happen in the middle. And we think it's a very high leverage place for us to be in the business of running programs that weave those threads of new insights, new approaches, new methods, weave them together. Typically, you have to integrate lots of them to solve an interesting problem. We want to weave them together and show that something radically new is different, and we want to bring along the people who are then going to run, whose minds could get changed with this new demonstration, who can then start implementing. And so then what does implementation look like? How do you actually do the change the world part, right, after you've shown that it's possible? And I think especially in this market economy driven system in the US, across the R&D environment, we've tended to think over this last century that you do R&D and then you have some result or prototype, and now commercialization is how it's going to reach impact. We certainly all know examples where that's, we're living in an information world in which that's precisely what's happened. But I think it's important to reset our frame, given the kinds of problems that we're now talking about innovating for, to also think about policies as what implementation can look like, to think about changing individual practices on a very broad scale as what implementation could look like. So maybe just to pick a particular example, think about, we were talking about all the insights that data can provide. So just a really simple example might be you're trying to figure out what transportation looks like in your city or your community. It was hard enough before coronavirus. Now it's incredibly difficult to figure out how do you have the kind of transportation that allows everyone in the community, without being stuck in traffic forever, to access jobs and schools and live their lives in a robust way. Well, the data that we can now bring to bear on that problem is actually quite dazzling. But if we're going to do this applied research, this sort of solutions research that shows how these new methods might lead to new practices for mass transit, the implementation it might be a blend of commercialization, but for sure in that case it's going to involve implementation and policy. And so I think opening our aperture to think about that is important for the class of problems that we're thinking about.
It definitely adds a dimension to the challenge as well, right? I mean, I think there's it's not that it's necessarily easy, but scaling for commercial purposes is a well-known path. Like there are processes and procedures. There's a way to get it done. There's, different levels of financing and financiers you go after for specific stages of your scale. I mean, it's all quite, there's just a well-trodden path. You can figure out how to do that. When it comes to some of these other areas, it takes a lot more creativity and being entrepreneurial to figure out, particularly when it comes to things like changing hearts and minds, right? This is the work that we do. Trust me, it's not easy. So So yeah, I think so. Interestingly, you talked a little bit about the research methodology. Part of the creativity, I guess, and the innovative approach that Actuate's taking is to apply DARPA methodology to these social problems. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why you think that's, why you believe that'll be an effective kind of innovative approach, one that maybe hasn't been taken before?
Absolutely. My co-founder is Wade Shen. He was a program manager at Darpa, a data science and artificial intelligence expert who did amazing programs. And we've loved working on this new challenge together because we share this passion about these kinds of major societal problems. But given our backgrounds, it's no surprise that we are inspired by much of what we learned in the DARPA model. We both have had the chance to work in many other environments, but that particular approach to applied research, to demonstrations of new ways of doing things, to this kind of solutions R&D that is Actuate's focus, that DARPA approach for that class of problems is very much our inspiration. We definitely don't think, though, that you can just copy and paste that methodology. So it's really much more of a matter of gleaning, what are the bones of that approach that we might start with, but then clearly you have to adapt it to the particular problem and the particular kinds of new methodologies that you're developing. So what is that all about? Well, first of all, what it is a phenomenally powerful methodology for solutions research. DARPA, of course, was started in the immediate aftermath of Sputnik, when the United States realized that its competitor in the Cold War had just put a satellite on orbit for the first time in human history. That got everyone's attention. And DARPA was a recognition that in addition to the places that do basic research and that develop military capabilities for the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, that the national security environment in the United States also needed a place where people came to work every single day to think about surprise and to make sure no one else surprised us. And then, of course, DARPA went on to solve that problem by creating surprises of its own. And that happened both on the national security side with specific military capabilities, stealth aircraft being an iconic example, but also in the course of pursuing these other enabling technologies, information technology, material science, and more recently biological technologies. In the work that DARPA did in those areas for national security, of course, those technologies have radically transformed our lives and our societies and the world. So when we look at that model, what we want to learn from that is, first of all, I think we deliberately are emulating DARPA's focus on this kind of solution R&D, again, downstream from basic research, but upstream from full-scale implementation. We think that's a huge leverage point. I think it's actually something that we tend to underinvest in the United States, and a particularly important leverage point for the US. So that's a starting point. And then the specific DARPA methodology is one that says, we're not going to do this by committee. Committees are great at taking all the risk out of projects, but in taking all the risk out, they usually take all the impact out. Not all the impact, but they certainly, take the sharp edges off of things. And sometimes you really want all those sharp edges because that's how you're really going to make a major advance. And so the whole DARPA methodology is centered on finding and then coaching amazing experts who can be program managers who define a program with a bold goal, lay out a feasible path to get there. It may be high risk, but it's still, at the end of the day, it may be barely feasible, but it does have to be feasible. And then who know how to project a vision and rally a community and have them all go charge after this seemingly intractable problem, and then actually show something different. And success for a DARPA program that we very much want to emulate at Actuate, although for our different class of problems, success in a program is you show the world something that people generally didn't think was possible. It's a big enough deal that it starts changing minds. And number two, you bring along the people whose minds you need to change, and they see it, and then they start if you show a new way to prevent chronic disease, you want insurers to start covering it. If you show a new way to do data and privacy, you want data-informed researchers and policymakers to be there to start implementing it. So those are the dual tracks that show something big and then bring along the implementers. And those are ways in which we're going to, not copy and paste, but be inspired and then adapt the DARPA model to our problems that we're tackling now.
So it sounds like you need a like a whole cadre of very charismatic entrepreneurs to grab the ball and run with it. Can we stay on the operating model for a little bit? We were talking just before this conversation started, just the two of us, about the critical mass you're going to create around this, around each of these areas in a very directed way. Now, you've just spoken about the program manager, and they're sort of the tip of the spear. How does it grow from there? And what kind of, I guess, coalition or team building scale are you foreseeing for any of these areas?
It might be easiest to answer that by taking a specific example. So I'll stick with our data and privacy program. Okay, the overarching model is to use the funds for a program to fund projects and efforts in universities, in companies of all sorts, and nonprofit organizations. We essentially want to build a virtual stellar team from the best talents wherever they live. And that's who actually does the work, managed and driven towards this hard, bold objective by our program manager. And I think the power of that model, which again, that was stolen directly from DARPA, the power of that model is upfront. It means you don't have to hire everyone under your own roof, and you can tap people where they are, which is pretty powerful to start with. On the back end, it's powerful for a different reason, because the programs that we're going to run will typically be 3 or 5 years. They're not forever programs. They set out to show this bold goal and to catalyze a change. But then we have to stop so that the implementers can go implement. And at the end of a 3 or 5 year program, the fact that we've been funding and working with and driving forward this, you're building an army of people who are infused with this vision, who are building components of this vision. And when we're done, they and their organizations become part of what implementation looks like. And we've seen this happen over and over again in DARPA stories. We hope to see it here. For example, if we go back to our data and privacy program, we will work probably with academic researchers on some of the applied research to map these privacy technologies to practical implementations that can serve many kinds of research questions. Those researchers will publish and their work will go out in the world. Almost always we will see graduate students from those programs who want to go commercialize something that comes out of that, or they want to go be part of establishing an infrastructure. If the government, for example, builds a national secure data service as part of the evidence-based policy movement that's starting across federal government, you can see how people from these academic research programs can end up being some of the people who go build that infrastructure that becomes operational. We'll work directly with researchers, people who are using data and trying to solve hard problems and are eager to get access to more data that they can combine. And we'll work with them to do experiments and to test our new technologies, but then they will become, we hope it works, and if it does, they become the carriers of the message, because they'll go out and say, look, I could do this problem that no one could ever do before because of this new way of combining data while protecting privacy. So that's how you go from the work that we want to do to having, it's almost Dumbledore's army that you're creating, that you want to have go out and start spreading the word and implementing.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, that's super. That's incredibly exciting. And I can't wait to see what comes of it.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Matter, a podcast by the Berggruen Institute that explores some of the biggest challenges facing our societies and shaping who we are as humans. During this time of great transformations, we need new ideas and deep, long-term thinking more than ever. We invite you to join us in discovery. You can find us on social media at Berggruen Institute, and please subscribe to Noema, our new digital and print magazine at noemamag.com.